It is late in Austin, Texas. The city is winding down, the way it always does after the last errands are run and the last conversations trail off into silence. Storefront lights click off one by one. Parking lots empty. Traffic thins until the road sounds soften into something distant and hollow. On West Anderson Lane, a small strip center sits quietly, unnoticed, its presence unremarkable. The kind of place people pass every day without ever truly seeing. Inside one of those storefronts is a yogurt shop. It is bright in a way meant to feel cheerful. Pastel colors, plastic chairs, tables wiped down so many times the surface has lost its original texture. The air smells faintly of sugar and cleaning solution, a combination so common it barely registers. This is a place meant for families, for children still sticky from playgrounds, for laughter and noise and casual mess. Even late at night, it tries to hold onto that feeling. Near the counter, 4 girls are finishing their shift. The evening has been slow, not unusual. A few customers drifted in and out earlier, then nothing. The machines hum softly, cycling through their routine. Outside, the windows reflect the fluorescent lights back into the empty parking lot. Inside, the girls talk about small things. School, work, plans that feel important only because they belong to the future. They are young, all of them. Their ages range from early teens to just barely adults. 2 of them are sisters. The others are friends, coworkers, girls who know each other well enough to share shifts, but not well enough to imagine how deeply their lives are about to intersect. As closing time approaches, they begin the familiar routine. Wiping surfaces, counting the register, stocking chairs. There is nothing unusual about their movements. Nothing that would stand out if someone were watching. No sense of urgency. No fear. Just the quiet rhythm of a late shift ending. At some point, the front door is locked. What happens next is not witnessed by anyone who will later be able to explain it. Sometime after midnight, a fire breaks out inside the yogurt shop. At first, it does not attract immediate attention. Fires are not rare in commercial spaces. Electrical issues, accidents, carelessness. The flames grow behind glass and walls, feeding on what they can. Smoke begins to gather, thick and dark, curling upward until it presses against the ceiling. When firefighters arrive, the building is already burning from the inside out. They force their way through the entrance. Heat rolls toward them. Visibility drops. The smell is wrong. Not just burning plastic or wood, but something heavier. Something that does not belong in a place like this. As they move deeper into the shop, they begin to understand. The fire is not the crime. It is an attempt to erase one. Inside, the bodies of 4 girls are found. They are together near the back of the shop. The fire has done damage, but not enough to hide everything. The scene is chaotic and quiet at the same time, frozen in a way that feels unnatural. There are signs of violence that did not come from the flames, evidence that the fire was set after something far worse had already occurred. The girls did not die in the fire. By the time investigators arrive, the shop is sealed off. Yellow tape cuts across the entrance. The parking lot fills with emergency vehicles, their lights flashing against the darkened storefronts nearby. Word spreads quickly. A yogurt shop. 4 girls. Murder. Austin wakes up to a nightmare it cannot immediately understand. The victims are identified one by one. Their names begin appearing on the news. Their faces follow soon after. School photos, family snapshots, smiles captured before anyone knew how fragile those moments were. 2 of them are sisters, aged 13 and 15. The others are 16 and 17. The youngest had been there only because her older sister was working. A decision that seemed harmless earlier in the day now feels unbearable in hindsight. The details that emerge are slow and incomplete. Investigators determine that the girls were bound, that they were assaulted, that they were shot. The order of events is difficult to reconstruct, complicated by fire damage and time. What is clear is that more than one person may have been involved. What is also clear is that whoever did this took steps to destroy evidence. The fire was deliberate. Accelerants are detected. Burn patterns suggest intent, not accident. Someone wanted the building to burn. Someone wanted what happened inside to disappear. But it didn't. The shop becomes the center of the city's attention. News vans line the street. Reporters speak in hushed voices that barely conceal their urgency. Parents keep their children closer. Schools hold assemblies. Candlelight vigils appear overnight, clusters of people standing silently with wax dripping onto sidewalks. Fear settles in, but so does confusion. There is no immediate suspect, no clear motive, no single thread investigators can pull that leads somewhere solid. The girls had no known enemies. The shop had no history of violence. The area was not considered particularly dangerous. Everything about the crime feels out of place. Detectives begin reconstructing the final hours. They interview friends, family members, coworkers. They ask about routines, about anyone who might have been watching, about strange customers or unfamiliar faces. They review what little evidence the fire left behind. There are partial fingerprints, fragments of DNA, shoe impressions distorted by heat and water. Each piece is carefully cataloged, carefully preserved, carefully hoped over. Time passes. Leads come in, then fade. Tips flood the department, most of them driven by fear or speculation. Some sound promising, others unravel quickly. The case grows heavy with information, but light on answers. Years later, arrests are made. 4 men are charged. The announcement feels like relief at first. Closure, some say. Progress, others insist. The accused are young men, some barely older than the victims were at the time of their deaths. Their names are released. Their faces appear on television screens. But the case does not move cleanly toward resolution. The evidence is thin. Statements change. Witness accounts shift under scrutiny. DNA does not align the way it should. Confessions are disputed. Timelines fracture when examined closely. Eventually, the charges are dropped. The men are released. The city is left exactly where it started, only now with the added weight of expectation and disappointment. A case once thought close to resolution slips back into uncertainty. The questions remain unanswered and sharp. The yogurt shop is eventually demolished. The building is removed, as if erasing the physical space might soften what happened there. A new structure takes its place. People drive past it every day. Some know what stood there before. Many do not. The case remains open. Evidence still exists, stored carefully, waiting. Advances in forensic science offer quiet hope, but no promises. The girls' families continue to live with a silence that never fully recedes. The fire burned out long ago. The crime did not. This is only the beginning. In the days after the fire, investigators return again and again to what little survived the heat. Charred debris is sifted through inch by inch. Walls are cut open. Floors are peeled back. Anything that might have been touched, moved, stepped on, or carried in is examined with a patience that borders on desperation. The shop no longer feels like a place where people once laughed. It feels like a sealed container for unanswered questions. The layout of the space becomes important. The front counter, the seating area, the narrow passage leading toward the back, a small restroom, a storage space. Each area is mapped, photographed, and reconstructed on paper. The investigators try to imagine movement, where someone would stand, where someone might hide, where someone might wait. The girls were found near the back of the shop, clustered close together. This detail stays with investigators longer than most. It suggests time, control, decisions made while the victims were still alive. It suggests that whoever did this was not panicked, not rushing. The fire came later. That order matters. Witnesses from nearby businesses are interviewed. A few remember seeing lights on late. Some recall a car in the parking lot, but no one can describe it clearly. No license plate, no defining marks, just a vague sense that something might have been there longer than usual. There is talk of footsteps, of voices, of sounds that didn't seem urgent enough to justify calling police at the time. All of it feels useless now, softened by hindsight. The register is checked. Cash is still inside. Nothing of obvious value appears to be missing. This does not look like a robbery. It does not look like something driven by money. Attention turns to the girls' lives. Friends are questioned gently at first, then more thoroughly. Teachers are asked about changes in behavior. Parents replay recent conversations in their minds, searching for moments they might have missed. Notes are checked. Phone records are pulled. Every connection becomes a possible doorway into understanding why these girls were here, together, on this night. Nothing emerges. They were ordinary teenagers. Busy, distracted, concerned with school, work, relationships that felt important in the moment and fleeting in retrospect. None of them were known to be in trouble. None were known to be afraid of anyone. This absence of motive begins to feel oppressive. As weeks turn into months, the case becomes part of Austin's identity in a way no one wants. It is discussed quietly in grocery stores. Parents exchange looks at school drop-offs. The phrase "yogurt shop murders" becomes shorthand for something too heavy to explain fully. Detectives feel the pressure. They receive thousands of tips. Some are sincere. Others are fueled by rumor, prejudice, or imagination. Names surface and disappear. Alibis are checked. Backgrounds are scrutinized. The process is slow, and every wrong turn costs time. Eventually, attention shifts toward a group of young men. Their connection to the case is not straightforward. No clear witness places them inside the shop that night. No physical evidence definitively links them to the scene. But statements are made. Stories overlap. Certain details seem to align just enough to feel promising. Interrogations stretch on. Hours pass in rooms designed to feel neutral, but never are. Voices remain calm. The same questions are asked again and again, rephrased slightly each time. Memory becomes malleable under that kind of pressure. Certainty weakens. Doubt grows. One of the men gives a statement that appears incriminating. It contains details that were not widely known. Investigators seize on it. This is the break they have been waiting for. Charges are filed. Arrests are made. For a moment, the city exhales. But relief proves temporary. Defense attorneys dismantle the statements piece by piece. They point out inconsistencies. They question how information was obtained. They highlight the lack of physical evidence. DNA does not match. Timelines collapse under scrutiny. The statements are recanted. The case unravels publicly, painfully. What once felt like progress begins to look like a mistake born of urgency and exhaustion. The men are released. Charges are dropped. For the families, the reversal is devastating. The wound reopens, deeper this time. Hope once offered is taken back without ceremony. Investigators are left with what they had before. An open case. Evidence that has not changed. Questions that have only grown louder. Years pass. Technology advances quietly in the background. DNA testing improves. Databases expand. Evidence is re-examined, sometimes with new tools, sometimes with the same old ones. Each review brings the same result. Nothing definitive. Nothing enough. The girls' names are remembered, then gradually spoken less often in public spaces. Time does what it always does. It moves forward without regard for resolution. But the case does not disappear. It waits. The silence surrounding it is not empty. It is heavy, layered with everything that was never said, never proven, never understood. The yogurt shop is gone, but the shape of what happened there remains, etched into memory rather than brick and glass. Somewhere the truth exists in full. It always does. But it remains separate from the record, from the evidence, from what can be shown or spoken aloud. The fire was meant to erase. Instead, it preserved a mystery that refuses to burn away. Long after the shop is torn down, long after the headlines fade, the details of that night continue to live inside case files and memory. Boxes of evidence remain sealed in controlled rooms. Each item has a label, a number, a date. They are quiet objects now, but each one once existed in the final hours of 4 lives. Investigators revisit the timeline again and again. The closing time, the last confirmed sightings, the locked door, the window in which the crime must have occurred. They narrow it, widen it, then narrow it again. Somewhere inside those hours is a sequence that makes sense, but it never fully comes into focus. the possibility of more than one attacker remains. The level of control required. The logistics. The movement of 4 victims within a confined space. It suggests coordination, or at least confidence. That detail troubles those who worked the case the most. Confidence implies familiarity. Familiarity implies proximity. Attention turns, repeatedly, to the idea that the perpetrators may have been in the shop before, that they may have known the layout, known the routines, known how long it would take before anyone noticed something was wrong. The yogurt shop was not isolated, but it was predictable. Predictability can be exploited. Still, no one fits cleanly into that shape. Rumors circulate over the years. Names whispered in private conversations. People who moved away suddenly. People who acted strangely afterward. People who later committed other crimes. None of it holds up under scrutiny. Suspicion alone is never enough. The families learn to live with a strange kind of permanence. The crime is always present, but never active. Birthdays pass. Anniversaries arrive. The calendar keeps moving, indifferent to what remains unresolved. Grief changes form, but does not disappear. Public interest spikes from time to time. An anniversary, a documentary, a renewed push for tips. Each resurgence brings a brief wave of attention, followed by the same quiet retreat. The case resists resolution, as if sealed off from certainty itself. Some investigators believe the fire did more than destroy evidence. They believe it altered perception, that it created gaps large enough for doubt to live comfortably. Fire consumes context. It removes edges. It turns specifics into suggestions. What remains is impression rather than fact. That impression is all anyone has left. There is no recording of the crime, no reliable eyewitness, no confession that survives scrutiny, just fragments, just the knowledge that something deliberate and controlled happened inside a place meant to feel safe. The city changes around the absence. New businesses open. New residents arrive who never knew the story. Others remember it clearly, the way certain events fix themselves permanently in time. For them, West Anderson Lane will always carry an extra weight. Late at night, the street looks ordinary again. Cars pass. Lights flicker on and off. The space where the shop once stood blends into the background of the city's rhythm. Nothing marks it. Nothing explains it. The case remains open. It exists in files and databases and conversations that trail off before reaching conclusions. It exists in the quiet knowledge that 4 girls went to work one night and never came home. It exists in the silence left behind by a fire that failed to do what it was meant to do. The truth has not surfaced. It waits untouched by time, somewhere just beyond what can be proven. Years turn into decades, and the case settles into a strange middle ground. It is not forgotten, but it is no longer actively pursued in the way it once was. Detectives retire. New investigators inherit old files. The language inside those folders reflects another era of policing, another way of thinking about crime. Notes written by hand. Assumptions shaped by the limits of the time. Each new set of eyes notices something different. Some focus on the sequence of the fire, others on the bindings, others on the decision to leave the bodies together rather than scattered. Every interpretation adds another layer, another possible explanation that cannot be tested anymore. The absence of a clear suspect creates room for speculation, and speculation fills silence easily. Stories circulate quietly. Theories grow elaborate. Some point outward, imagining strangers passing through the city. Others point inward, suggesting familiarity, routine, someone who blended in easily enough to never stand out. None of it becomes evidence. What remains constant is the sense that the crime required patience. The girls were not taken from the street. There was no forced entry caught on record. Whoever entered that shop did so without raising alarm. Whatever happened unfolded over time, not in a sudden burst of chaos. That detail alone keeps the case unsettling, because patience suggests intention, and intention suggests choice. Investigators have long debated whether the fire was planned from the beginning or decided on afterward. The accelerants imply preparation, but the chaotic nature of fire implies risk. Fire can destroy evidence, but it can also attract attention quickly. Choosing it means accepting uncertainty. It suggests a confidence that nothing would be traced back. The girls' families live with that confidence hanging over them. The knowledge that someone believed they would never be identified. That belief, more than anything else, is what lingers. Over the years, forensic science evolves. DNA analysis becomes more sensitive. Databases expand. Cold cases across the country are reopened and solved. Each breakthrough elsewhere reignites hope here, briefly. Evidence is rechecked. Samples are retested. The results remain inconclusive. The fire did its work too well. The yogurt shop itself becomes a memory rather than a place. Younger residents hear about it as a story from the past, something distant, almost unreal. For those who lived through it, the memory stays sharp, anchored to a specific feeling rather than a specific detail. A feeling of disbelief. A feeling that something fundamental was violated. The crime resists narrative closure. There is no final confrontation. No courtroom revelation. No moment where everything aligns. Instead, there is only a sustained absence, stretched across time. At night, Austin still grows quiet. Streets still empty. Storefronts still glow and dim. Ordinary routines continue, uninterrupted by what once happened inside a brightly lit shop, filled with machines humming softly in the background. The silence that followed that night never truly ended. It simply learned how to exist alongside everything else. The case remains open, not paused, not concluded, simply waiting. This story has not reached its end yet. Time does not close the distance between what happened and what is known. It only changes the way people carry it. The case files grow older. Paper yellows. Ink fades. Digital copies replace originals, but the content remains the same. Names, dates, measurements, diagrams of a space that no longer exists. The physical evidence becomes increasingly fragile, not because it disappears, but because meaning erodes. Context is lost when the people who gathered it are no longer there to explain why something felt important at the time. A note in the margin, a word underlined, a question mark that never received an answer. Some investigators believe the key detail was overlooked early, buried under the urgency to solve the case quickly. Others believe there was never a clear key to begin with, that the crime was constructed in a way that left no clean entry point, no obvious mistake. The bindings suggest restraint, not panic. The positioning suggests control. The lack of noise reports suggests compliance, at least initially. These details point in different directions at the same time, refusing to settle into a single interpretation. The girls were together. That fact alone narrows certain possibilities while expanding others. Keeping 4 victims contained requires authority, fear, or trust, possibly a combination of all 3. Each option carries implications that never fully align with the known facts. Trust implies familiarity. Fear implies threat. Authority implies certainty. None of these can be proven. The fire complicates everything. Heat distorts. Smoke obscures. Water washes away traces that might have mattered years later. The choice to burn the scene feels both calculated and reckless. A final act that introduces chaos into an otherwise controlled sequence. That contradiction becomes a defining feature of the case. Controlled violence followed by uncontrolled destruction. The investigation circles back to the same limited set of possibilities again and again. A stranger passing through. Someone from the surrounding area. Someone known casually, not well enough to be remembered immediately, but well enough to avoid suspicion. Each theory remains plausible and unprovable. For the families, life continues in fragments. Some move away. Some stay. Some speak publicly. Others withdraw. Grief expresses itself differently in each household, shaped by personalities, by time, by the absence of answers. The girls remain fixed in memory at the ages they were. They do not grow older in photographs. They do not change. The world moves forward around them, but they stay where the timeline ended. Occasionally, law enforcement issues renewed requests for information. The language is careful, hopeful but restrained. They emphasize that memories change, that details once dismissed might matter now, that someone might remember something differently after all this time. Silence follows. The crime does not resolve itself quietly in the background. It simply waits, unresolved, occupying a space that cannot be filled by speculation or time. It exists as a permanent interruption in the city's history, one that never received a proper ending. Late nights still come to Austin. The city still settles into itself. Lights still reflect off empty pavement. Somewhere in that quiet, the shape of that night remains unchanged. 4 girls went to work. A fire followed. Nothing since has been enough to explain it. The story continues unfinished. As years pass, the case begins to exist more in absence than in action. There are no arrests to follow, no court dates to anticipate, no public developments to hold on to. Instead, there is a long stretch of stillness where nothing changes, and that stillness becomes part of the story itself. Former investigators speak about it quietly years later when asked. They remember the feeling more than the details, the sense that something essential never aligned, that the case resisted structure, that every attempt to impose order on it collapsed under its own weight. They remember the night scenes, the burned shell of the shop, the smell that lingered longer than it should have, the knowledge that whatever had happened inside was not spontaneous, that it required time, intention, and a willingness to stay. Staying is what unsettles people the most. This was not a crime committed in motion. It did not involve a quick escape or a sudden interruption. It unfolded within a closed space, over a period of time that has never been precisely measured. That duration hangs over the case like a shadow, impossible to ignore. Some believe the perpetrators waited until the area was fully quiet, that they knew when nearby businesses closed, that they understood how long it would take before smoke or flames drew attention. These beliefs are grounded in inference, not proof, but they persist because they fit too neatly to dismiss. The yogurt shop had large windows, glass that faced outward. Anyone inside would have been visible under normal circumstances. That no one noticed anything unusual suggests either extraordinary timing or extraordinary control. Again, control. The girls were young, inexperienced. At work, their environment was familiar but not secure. The idea that familiarity could be turned against them adds another layer of unease. Safety is often assumed, rarely tested, and almost never questioned until it fails. The city's relationship with the case changes over time. What was once raw becomes distant. What was once discussed openly becomes something people reference indirectly. The words "that yogurt shop" carry meaning without explanation. New generations grow up without knowing the names, without recognizing the location, without understanding why older residents pause slightly when driving past that stretch of road. Memory thins. The case remains open in name, but functionally dormant. Evidence sits. Leads are exhausted. Resources are directed elsewhere. This does not mean the case is abandoned, only that it waits for something new to enter its orbit. A confession, a piece of forgotten evidence, a memory that surfaces unexpectedly. None arrives. The unanswered nature of the crime allows it to absorb other fears. It becomes a reference point, a symbol of randomness, of vulnerabilities, of how little control people truly have over ordinary nights. At times, the case resurfaces in media. A documentary, a long-form article. Each retelling brings the same facts arranged slightly differently, as if rearrangement alone might reveal something hidden. It never does. The girls remain at the center of every version, their lives reduced to final hours, their personalities flattened by necessity. There is no way to fully reconstruct who they were beyond fragments offered by those who knew them. That loss of dimensionality is another kind of violence, subtle but persistent. Somewhere, someone knows what happened inside that shop. That knowledge exists as a complete narrative, uninterrupted, unambiguous. It has simply never crossed into the world of proof. Until it does, the case remains suspended. Not resolved, not explained, not closed, only waiting in the same quiet it has occupied since the fire burned out and left everything else behind. The passage of time creates a false sense of distance. On paper, decades separate the present from that night. In memory, the separation is thinner. The case has never found a place to settle. It does not belong fully to the past because nothing replaced it. No verdict arrived to seal it off. No answer came to quiet it. Instead, it lingers in an unresolved present. The files are still there. They are opened occasionally, not with urgency, but with obligation. A reminder that the work was never finished, that something remains undone. Each time they are reviewed, the same obstacles present themselves. Gaps that cannot be filled, assumptions that cannot be tested, evidence that cannot speak beyond what it already has. Investigators know the limits now. They understand what the case can and cannot yield. They know which questions will never be answered by the existing material. This knowledge does not bring peace. It only clarifies the boundaries of uncertainty. The fire, again, stands at the center of everything. It was not random. It was not a reaction. It was a decision made after the violence was complete. That sequence matters because it suggests reflection. Someone stopped and chose what came next. That pause is unsettling. It implies awareness of consequence, an understanding that what had just happened needed to be concealed. It implies that whoever was responsible expected scrutiny, investigation, pursuit. And yet, despite that expectation, they took a risk that paid off. Nothing definitive survived the flames. The girls' final moments remain inaccessible, sealed behind damage and time. Their fear, their confusion, their attempts to understand what was happening are not part of the record. They exist only as an absence, a silence that cannot be interpreted without speculation. That silence is respected, but it is also heavy. Over the years, certain details take on disproportionate significance. The locked door, the lack of forced entry, the absence of screams reported by witnesses. Each one suggests control, but none explains how it was achieved. Control can come from many places. Authority, threat, deception, familiarity. None of these leave obvious marks. None of them register clearly in forensic evidence. They live in human behavior, which is far more difficult to document. The case never provides enough to choose one explanation over another. For the families, time introduces a complicated duality. Life continues because it must, but the past does not recede in the way people expect it to. It remains active, present, capable of resurfacing without warning. A headline, a memory, a question asked by someone too young to remember the event firsthand. There is no answer to give. Public memorials come and go. Anniversaries are marked quietly. The city acknowledges the loss without reopening it fully. It has learned how to carry unresolved grief as part of its landscape. The yogurt shop murders become a reference point for other crimes, other discussions about safety, about youth, about randomness. They are invoked as an example rather than an event. The specificity fades, replaced by a general sense of dread. But the specifics still exist, unchanged. 4 girls, 1 night, a fire set after everything else was already over. Those facts remain intact, resistant to reinterpretation. Somewhere the chain of events is complete. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It includes motives, decisions, moments of hesitation or certainty. It exists in full, even if it has never been spoken aloud. Until that narrative intersects with proof, the case remains suspended in a state that feels unnatural. Crimes are expected to conclude. Stories are expected to end. This one refuses to do either. The silence after the fire was not an ending. It was a continuation. The story is still moving forward, even if no one can see how. With distance comes reinterpretation. Details once considered fixed begin to feel uncertain, not because they changed, but because their meaning was never fully understood to begin with. The case becomes less about what is known and more about what cannot be verified. That shift alters the way people think about it. Early assumptions are revisited, not overturned but softened. Investigators who once believed strongly in one direction admit, years later, that certainty was premature. Others acknowledge that the pressure to solve the case shaped the narrative more than the evidence did. Urgency filled gaps that facts could not. The environment of the early investigation matters. The shock was immediate. 4 victims, all young, all killed in a place associated with safety and innocence. The demand for answers arrived faster than answers could be built. Every decision made under that pressure left marks on the case that never fully faded. Interviews conducted in that climate carry a different weight now. Statements given late at night. Memories shaped by suggestion, repetition, fatigue. What once felt definitive is reclassified as unreliable. What once seemed insignificant becomes ambiguous rather than irrelevant. This instability makes the case resistant to final interpretation. The yogurt shop itself, before it was destroyed, had been a simple place. Predictable, open, bright. Its transformation into a crime scene disrupted something basic in the collective understanding of safety. Violence is expected in certain contexts. This was not one of them. That dissonance continues to shape the way the crime is remembered. The lack of witnesses remains one of the most unsettling aspects. The shop was not isolated. Nearby businesses existed. Roads were active earlier in the evening. Yet no one saw anything that could later be used with confidence. No one heard anything that could be traced back clearly. Silence again becomes central. Silence during the crime. Silence afterward. Silence in the years that follow. The perpetrators, whoever they were, moved through that silence without interruption. They entered. They stayed. They left. The fire followed, but even that did not immediately bring clarity. Firefighters arrived to flames, not answers. What they found altered the course of many lives, including their own. First responders rarely speak publicly about what they encountered that night. When they do, it is brief, measured, and incomplete. Some scenes do not lend themselves to description, even decades later. Investigators often describe the case as heavy. Not complex in a technical sense, but emotionally dense. Every file, every photograph, every piece of evidence carries the awareness that nothing has resolved. That weight accumulates. The girls' names remain present in the documentation, but their voices are absent. Their thoughts, reactions, and understanding of what was happening were never recorded. There is no internal narrative to consult, only external reconstruction. That absence cannot be filled. Speculation sometimes drifts toward motives that cannot be proven. Power, control, opportunity, cruelty. None of these require explanation in the way other crimes sometimes do. Some acts occur simply because they can. That possibility is difficult to accept, but it cannot be excluded. The case allows for too many explanations and confirms none. As time stretches on, the evidence becomes frozen, while interpretation continues to move. New theories emerge, then fade. Each one offers a different lens, but none reveal anything concrete. The truth remains intact and inaccessible. The city lives around it. People shop, work, raise families. The street changes. The buildings change. The routines remain. Only the memory of that night stays fixed, unaltered by progress or decay. The fire did not erase the crime. It preserved it in an unfinished state. And so the case endures, not as an active investigation, but as a sustained absence of resolution. A space where answers should exist, but do not. The story continues to exist without an ending, held in place by silence and time. There is a point where investigation becomes stewardship, where the work is no longer about chasing new leads, but about protecting what remains intact. The Austin yogurt shop case reaches that point quietly. No announcement marks it. No formal transition is made. It simply shifts from pursuit to preservation. Evidence is maintained. Procedures are followed. The case is never closed on paper. It is held in a careful balance between hope and realism. Nothing new is promised. Nothing old is discarded. This state feels unnatural to those who expect stories to resolve. Crimes are supposed to conclude with clarity, with responsibility assigned, with events ordered into something that makes sense. This one resists that structure. It remains disordered, incomplete, and therefore deeply unsettling. The lack of resolution changes how the crime is remembered. It is no longer anchored to a specific narrative. Instead, it becomes a space people return to when thinking about vulnerability, randomness, and the limits of certainty. It stands as a reminder that not everything yields to effort. That realization is difficult to accept. Investigators often say that cases speak. That evidence tells a story if listened to closely enough. In this case, the evidence speaks in fragments. It offers hints without conclusions. It suggests possibilities without confirmation. It does not lie, but it does not explain itself either. The fire remains the loudest voice in that silence. It destroyed context, but it also created it. Without the fire, the crime might have looked different, more immediate, more legible. With it, everything is filtered through damage and loss. That filter cannot be removed. The girl's final hours remain undefined. There is no reliable sequence of dialogue, no clear moment when fear began, no point at which resistance was attempted or abandoned. These details matter, not for sensational reasons, but because they are human. They would have added shape to what now exists only as outline. Instead, there is only the aftermath. Over time, even professionals become cautious in how they speak about the case. Definitive language is avoided. Certainty is treated as suspect. The longer a case remains unsolved, the more dangerous confidence becomes. It invites error. It creates false endings. So the language softens. Possibly, likely, unclear. These words dominate the record. The families learn to navigate a world where closure is something other people talk about, but they never experience. There is no final chapter to absorb, no explanation to integrate into memory. Grief does not resolve itself. It simply changes shape over time. Some families channel that grief outward. Others turn inward. Both approaches coexist without judgment. There is no correct way to live with unanswered loss. Public memory continues to thin. The case becomes less present in everyday conversation. New tragedies take its place in headlines. Attention shifts as it always does. The yogurt shop murders become a reference rather than a focus. But references still carry weight. They carry the implication that something fundamental went unresolved. That despite effort, resources, time, and intention, the truth did not emerge. That knowledge lingers, quietly undermining assumptions about control and justice. The site itself offers no answers. It does not mark what happened. It does not explain the absence. It exists as any other piece of the city now does, layered over what came before it. The past is not visible unless remembered, and memory is uneven. Some nights the city grows quiet in the same way it did then. The conditions repeat. The environment aligns. Nothing happens. That repetition creates a subtle unease, because it demonstrates how easily ordinary nights resemble the beginning of something irreversible. That realization does not fade. The case remains open not because it is actively pursued, but because it cannot be closed honestly. Closing implies understanding. Understanding never arrived. So it stays, held in records, held in memories, held in silence. The story does not end here. It simply continues without movement, suspended in the space between what happened and what will never be fully known. The years stretch outward, and the case becomes something that exists alongside life rather than within it. It does not intrude daily, but it never fully disappears. It is carried quietly, like a weight that adjusts itself so it can be borne without constant attention. Those who work the case remember specific moments rather than a continuous effort. A photograph examined too long. A diagram redrawn one more time. A late-night realization that led nowhere. The memory of hope arriving suddenly, then leaving just as quickly. Hope in this case has always been fragile. The absence of a clear narrative creates room for doubt, and doubt reshapes everything. When nothing can be proven, every interpretation feels provisional. Confidence erodes over time, replaced by restraint. The case teaches caution not through resolution, but through failure. The girl's final shift becomes symbolic in retrospect, though it was unremarkable at the time. A normal workday, a routine responsibility, something thousands of young people do without incident every night. That ordinariness is what makes the crime resist explanation. There was no escalation, no visible warning, no deviation from routine that might signal danger. The break from normality was sudden and complete. Investigators have long noted that crimes without obvious precursors are the hardest to solve. They offer no gradual trail, no behavioral buildup. They emerge fully formed, leaving behind only aftermaths. This case exemplifies that difficulty. The yogurt shop was not targeted because of what it was. It became significant only because of what happened inside it. That distinction matters. It suggests that the location was a means, not a motive. The crime could have occurred elsewhere, under different circumstances, if opportunity aligned. Opportunity is a quiet factor. It does not announce itself. It waits for alignment of time, access, and vulnerability. When those elements converge, the result can feel random, even though it is not. The case never reveals whether the perpetrators planned extensively or acted on a sudden decision. Both possibilities remain viable. Both are equally unsettling. Planning suggests calculation. Impulse suggests unpredictability. Neither offers comfort. The absence of closure alters the emotional landscape around the case. There is no final moment of release, no shift from tension to understanding. Instead, there is a sustained, low-level unease that never fully dissipates. People learn to live with that unease. They learn to place it in context, to acknowledge it without dwelling on it, to accept that some events do not resolve into lessons or clarity. They simply remain. The families, meanwhile, continue their lives in parallel with the case. They mark time in personal ways, not by anniversaries of the crime alone, but by milestones that arrive without the people who should have been there to witness them. That absence is permanent. The public record of the case remains unchanged. Facts are fixed. Evidence is catalogued. There are no new chapters to add. The story exists as a collection of moments that never coalesce into a whole. This incompleteness becomes its defining feature. At night, when the city grows quiet, there is nothing to distinguish one ordinary evening from another. The conditions that once allowed the crime to unfold still exist. Streets still empty. Businesses still close. Lights still reflect off glass and pavement. Nothing has fundamentally changed. That realization does not provoke panic. It provokes reflection. The understanding that safety is often assumed rather than guaranteed. That predictability can coexist with vulnerability. That silence is not always peaceful. The yogurt shop murders remain unsolved not because they were forgotten, but because they resisted explanation. They persist as a reminder of the limits of investigation and the endurance of uncertainty. The longer the case remains unresolved, the more it begins to resemble a fixed point rather than an active pursuit. It does not advance. It does not retreat. It simply remains, anchored in the past but influencing the present in subtle ways. Those who study it closely notice how often certainty collapses under scrutiny. A detail that once seemed solid dissolves when examined from another angle. A timeline that felt precise stretches when tested. Each attempt to stabilize the narrative introduces new instability. The crime does not allow itself to be simplified. The idea that someone could enter a brightly lit shop, control 4 young people, remain long enough to commit violence, and then deliberately set a fire without interruption continues to defy easy explanation. It demands either extraordinary confidence or extraordinary luck. Possibly both. Confidence implies experience. Luck implies chance. The case never reveals which mattered more. Over time, the focus shifts from identifying suspects to understanding conditions. What allowed this to happen? Not in a preventative sense, but in an explanatory one. How an ordinary environment became a closed system. How routine masked vulnerability. How familiarity created opportunity. These questions have no answers that can be tested. They exist only as reflections, shaped by the absence of resolution. The fire is often described as an attempt to erase, but it also created permanence. It ensured the crime would never be fully reconstructed. It introduced damage that no future technology can completely reverse. In doing so, it froze the case in a state of partial visibility. Enough is known to confirm that something terrible occurred. Not enough is known to explain it. That imbalance is what sustains the unease. The girl's final interactions with the world remain undefined. There is no record of fear escalating, no documentation of resistance or compliance, no indication of how they perceived what was happening. Their internal experience is entirely absent from the narrative. This absence is not filled by imagination. It is respected by silence. As the years accumulate, the the case becomes a quiet benchmark for unsolved violence. It is referenced when discussing investigative limits, when explaining why some crimes remain unresolved despite effort. It serves as an example without ever becoming instructive. Examples usually teach something. This one only reminds. The reminder is simple and unsettling. That not all events yield meaning. That some actions exist without explanation. That resolution is not guaranteed by time, technology, or intention. The city continues to function around this understanding. It does not stop. It adapts. It incorporates the unresolved into its history without resolving it. The memory becomes part of the background, present but not dominant. For those who carry the case personally, there is no background. There is only presence. The unanswered questions do not fade. They change shape, but they remain. The site where the shop once stood does not acknowledge what happened there. No marker interrupts the ordinary flow of the street. No sign invites reflection. The absence is complete, and yet absence is not the same as erasure. The story remains intact in fragments, in files, in memory, in the persistent recognition that something remains unfinished. That recognition does not diminish with time. It becomes more precise. The case does not move toward an ending. It holds its position, unchanged, waiting for something that may never arrive. The silence that followed the fire has not been broken. It has only been carried forward. The case does not age the way other stories do. It does not soften at the edges. It does not gain clarity through repetition. Each retelling preserves the same blank spaces, the same fractures where explanation should exist. Time does not refine it. Time only stretches it. What remains striking is how little the setting mattered once the crime began. The yogurt shop was chosen, but it was not special. It could have been any small business, any brightly lit room with predictable routines and young employees closing late. The ordinariness of the place becomes part of the unease because it suggests that nothing about the location itself offered protection. Safety had been assumed. The assumption went unchallenged until it failed completely. Investigators have often noted that crimes involving children carry a different gravity, not because the acts are more violent, but because the imbalance of power is absolute. In this case, that imbalance defines every unanswered question. 4 young girls, 1 or more perpetrators. Control was established quickly and maintained long enough for nothing to interrupt it. That duration matters more than the violence itself. Duration means opportunity was not lost. It means fear did not trigger immediate escape. It means the situation remained contained. How that containment was achieved remains the most persistent mystery. There are no definitive signs of forced resistance, no evidence of a struggle that escalated into chaos. This absence suggests compliance, but compliance born of what remains unclear. Threat, deception, authority, familiarity. Each explanation accounts for some details and contradicts others. The case refuses to choose. The fire follows as a separate act, distinct in motive and function. It is not part of the violence itself. It is a response to it, an attempt to control what comes next. In that sense, it represents a different mindset than the one required to commit the murders. 2 mental states, 1 sequence. That division suggests reflection, a moment where decisions were made about consequences rather than actions. The fire was not impulsive. It was intentional. Someone stayed long enough to ensure it would take hold. That staying remains the most unsettling aspect. Most violent crimes involve escape, movement, distance. This one involved presence, remaining inside the space after everything was already over, accepting the risk of discovery in order to remove traces. That choice worked. The lack of resolution does not mean the case lacks truth. It means the truth exists beyond reach. Somewhere outside documentation, outside testimony, outside proof. It exists as a complete narrative that has never intersected with accountability. That separation is what defines the case. The families continue to exist on one side of that divide. The perpetrators, wherever they are, exist on the other. Between them is silence, uninterrupted and unbroken. Occasionally, something nearly surfaces. A tip that feels different. a name mentioned with unusual specificity, a memory described with unexpected clarity. Each time, hope stirs briefly before settling back into restraint. Nothing crosses the threshold into certainty. The city has learned how to hold this absence without constant attention. It does not resolve it. It does not explain it. It simply accommodates it as part of its history. A dark point that cannot be illuminated, only acknowledged. The case does not move toward conclusion. It remains exactly where it has always been, suspended between what happened and what will never be proven. The fire burned. The girls were lost. The silence remained. The unresolved nature of the case slowly reshapes how it is spoken about, even among those closest to it. Language becomes careful. Certain phrases are avoided. The crime is no longer described in vivid terms, but in outlines and implications. What cannot be known begins to matter more than what can. Investigators who revisit the case years later often describe a sense of restraint that develops over time. Early confidence gives way to humility. The recognition that effort does not guarantee outcome settles in. This is not resignation, but acceptance of limits. The limits are everywhere. They exist in the fire damage that cannot be undone, in the evidence that can no longer be retested without being consumed, in the witnesses whose memories have faded or altered, in the suspects who were once examined too closely or not closely enough. Every path leads back to the same impasse. The case teaches nothing about motive with certainty. It offers no clear psychological profile. It does not align cleanly with patterns seen in other crimes. Each attempt to contextualize it leaves something essential unexplained. That resistance to categorization keeps the case alive in a particular way. It does not fade into familiarity. It never becomes predictable. It remains unsettling because it refuses to fit. The girl's last night remains framed by normalcy, closing duties, routine movements, a familiar environment. There was no visible transition from safety to danger, at least none that survived the fire. The shift from ordinary to catastrophic happened quietly, without witnesses, without warning. That quietness is central. The absence of sound, the absence of interruption, the absence of clarity. These absences shape the entire narrative. The city's response over time reflects this complexity. There is remembrance without resolution, acknowledgement without explanation. The case is not forgotten, but it is no longer actively interrogated by the public. It exists as a background truth rather than a foreground demand. This does not diminish its impact. It alters it. The case becomes something people carry rather than confront. It is referenced indirectly, remembered selectively, passed down as context rather than detail, a reminder that some events do not conclude in a way that satisfies expectation. The families remain the only constant presence across all phases of the case. Investigators change. Officials change. Public attention shifts. The families remain anchored to the same unanswered questions they had at the beginning. Their experience does not evolve toward understanding. It evolves toward endurance. The evidence remains preserved, not because it promises answers, but because it represents the possibility of answers. That possibility, however remote, is enough to prevent closure. Closing the case would require certainty. Certainty never arrived. The yogurt shop murders exist in a permanent present tense. They are not actively unfolding, but they are not finished either. They occupy a space between event and explanation that cannot be collapsed. The fire meant to erase achieved something else entirely. It ensured that the crime would never be fully known. It transformed the event into a question that cannot be answered with finality. That question remains suspended. The story is still moving forward in time, but not in meaning. It waits unchanged for something that may never surface. As the case moves further away from the night itself, the distance does not bring perspective. It brings distortion. What was once immediate becomes abstract. What was once specific becomes symbolic. The crime shifts from an event into a presence, something that exists without needing to be actively recalled. That presence is quiet but persistent. Those who encounter the case later often expect complexity. They expect hidden codes, overlooked clues, intricate conspiracies. Instead, they find simplicity fractured by absence. A small shop, a late shift, 4 girls, a fire. The simplicity feels wrong, as if something so devastating should be accompanied by something more elaborate. But it is not. The lack of complexity becomes its own complication. There is nothing to unravel because there is nothing fully visible. The case offers no puzzle with missing pieces. It offers fragments without a frame. The night itself remains unreachable. There is no reliable reconstruction that captures its progression. Only starting points and end results. The middle is lost to damage and silence. That missing middle is where understanding should live. Investigators sometimes describe the case as static, not because nothing happened, but because nothing has changed since it did. The same facts remain. The same uncertainties persist. Time has not added anything new, nor has it taken anything away. This stasis is difficult to reconcile with the passage of decades. Crimes are expected to evolve through investigation. They accumulate clarity. They move closer to resolution. This one does not. It remains fixed, unaffected by effort or advancement. The yogurt shop murders resist narrative momentum. There is no arc, no rise and fall, only a sudden rupture followed by an extended stillness. That stillness becomes the dominant feature. People who learn about the case years later often describe a sense of incompleteness that lingers long after the details fade. The feeling that something essential was withheld, that the story stopped prematurely, not because it was finished, but because it could not continue. That feeling is accurate. The perpetrators, whoever they were, succeeded in one objective. They prevented understanding. They created a void where explanation should have been. That void remains intact. The families continue to live with the consequences of that success. Their lives are shaped not just by loss, but by uncertainty. There is no narrative to anchor grief, no explanation to absorb, no resolution to mark the boundary between past and present. The case does not provide an end point. It does not allow transition. Instead, it creates a loop. Each return to the details leads back to the same questions. Each question leads to the same absence of answers. The loop does not close. It repeats. The city has learned to coexist with this repetition. It does not seek to resolve it. It acknowledges it quietly. The memory exists without being actively processed. It is part of the background architecture of the place. The shop is gone. The street remains. Life continues, but the absence persists. The fire did not consume the truth. It concealed it. And concealment, unlike destruction, leaves something intact. Something waiting. Something unreachable but present. The story has not concluded. It has simply stopped moving. What becomes clear over time is that the case no longer belongs solely to investigators or to the families. It belongs to the space between them, a shared silence that neither side can fill. The questions have been asked so many times that they no longer sound sharp. They sound worn, rounded by repetition, but no less unanswered. The idea of motive fades first, not because it is unimportant, but because it proves unreachable. Without suspects, motive becomes speculation. Speculation becomes noise. Eventually, it is set aside. What remains is action without explanation. Action is easier to document. 4 girls were restrained. They were assaulted. They were killed. A fire was set afterward. Those facts do not change. They do not soften. They do not require interpretation to remain disturbing. They exist independently of motive. The lack of motive removes a sense of narrative logic. Crimes are often understood through reasons, however disturbing they may be. This one offers none. It presents violence without context, control without justification, destruction without explanation. That absence creates a specific kind of unease. Not fear of repetition, but fear of randomness. The sense that order can be interrupted without warning, without cause, without meaning. Investigators sometimes describe this case as one that doesn't talk back. Evidence usually responds to effort. It yields patterns. It rewards persistence. This case does not. It absorbs attention without giving anything in return. The fire is central to that silence, but not solely responsible. Even without it, the crime would have been difficult to explain. The fire simply ensured that difficulty would become permanent. Fire destroys sequence. It erases margins. It turns specifics into approximations. What survived did so unevenly. Some details remain precise. Others exist only as estimates. This unevenness makes reconstruction unstable. Each attempt to clarify one element blurs another. The case becomes a study in imbalance. The victims are known in name and age, but not in final experience. The perpetrators are known in action, but not in identity. The location is known, but no longer exists. The crime is known, but not understood. Each known element is paired with an absence. This pairing defines the case more than any single fact. As years continue to pass, the investigation is no longer driven by momentum, but by responsibility. Responsibility to preserve, to remain available, to acknowledge that something unresolved still exists. The case is never declared cold in the way people imagine. It is not abandoned. It is simply inactive, waiting without expectation. Expectation requires precedent. This case offers none. Those who encounter the story for the first time often search for a moment where it should end, a point where something decisive occurs. They do not find it. The narrative does not provide release. It does not narrow. It remains open in every direction. That openness is not expansive. It is hollow. The yogurt shop murders exist as an interruption in time. Not a chapter, not a turning point, an interruption. Something that cut into ordinary life and never allowed it to fully resume in the same way. The families carry that interruption forward. It shapes their lives without defining them completely. It exists alongside everything else, present but not dominant, heavy but familiar. The city carries it differently, as memory rather than experience, as reference rather than reality, as something acknowledged but rarely confronted directly. Both forms of carrying are valid. Neither resolves anything. The case remains suspended between acknowledgement and explanation. It does not ask to be solved. It simply exists, unchanged, unyielding. The fire went out. The evidence remained. The silence settled in, and it has not lifted. The silence surrounding the case becomes a presence of its own, not empty, not passive, but active in the way it shapes thought. It determines what can be said and what cannot. It defines the boundaries of discussion without ever announcing itself. In time, the silence becomes familiar. Those closest to the case recognize it immediately. It appears when conversations slow, when details are revisited for the 100th time and nothing new emerges, when the same questions surface again, not because they are useful, but because they are all that remain. The investigation reached every natural stopping point long ago. What continues beyond that is something else, a kind of guardianship, an agreement unspoken that the case will not be allowed to disappear completely, even if it cannot advance. This is not optimism. It is refusal. Refusal to let the event dissolve into abstraction. Refusal to let 4 lives become statistics. Refusal to accept that unanswered means unimportant. The difficulty is that importance does not generate answers. The physical reality of the crime remains fixed. The shop, the night, the fire, these elements do not change with retelling. They resist reinterpretation. They remain stubbornly literal, grounded in place and time. What changes is everything around them. Investigators age. Technologies shift. Cultural expectations evolve. What once seemed plausible becomes unlikely. What once seemed unlikely becomes possible. The case absorbs these shifts without yielding anything in return. It remains static while the world moves. The lack of witnesses continues to defy logic, not because it is impossible, but because it is improbable. The alignment required for such complete invisibility is rare. That rarity fuels speculation, but speculation leads nowhere. Rare does not mean impossible. Improbable does not mean untrue. The case sits precisely at that intersection. Some have suggested that the absence of witnesses implies inside knowledge. Others suggest timing, so precise it bordered on coincidence. Both interpretations rely on assumptions that cannot be tested. Both remain equally viable and equally unprovable. The fire complicates even those interpretations. It suggests foresight, but it also suggests risk. It required remaining at the scene longer, increasing the chance of detection. That risk was taken anyway. Why that risk was acceptable remains unknown. This decision point is one of the few moments where intent is visible, even if motive is not. Someone made a choice about aftermath, about erasure, about control extending beyond the act itself. That choice succeeded. The lack of accountability is not the same as absence of guilt. It is absence of confirmation, a distinction that matters deeply to those who live with the consequences. The families do not speak of justice in absolutes anymore. Words change when they are used too often without effect. Language becomes careful, restrained. Expectations narrow. Hope becomes conditional. It exists, but it does not dominate. It is carried quietly, without ceremony. It does not announce itself. It does not demand resolution. The city mirrors this restraint. There are no permanent memorials that demand attention. No markers that interrupt routine. The memory exists without physical reinforcement. It relies on transmission rather than structure. Stories passed quietly. References made indirectly. Silence filling the rest. The yogurt shop murders do not recede into the past in a conventional way. They remain present without being visible. A latent awareness rather than an active concern. That awareness is enough to unsettle. The story does not build toward an ending. It does not narrow toward conclusion. It maintains its shape, incomplete and unresolved, resisting the pressure to become something coherent. The fire ended quickly. The aftermath did not, and the space between what happened and what is known remains exactly as wide as it was in the beginning. The story continues, still unfinished. What endures most strongly is the sense that the case exists outside of time. It does not belong to the era in which it happened, nor does it belong fully to the present. It sits between them, unchanged, unaffected by the decades that have passed. While everything else accumulates context, this crime remains stripped of it. The details that survive are stark in their simplicity. 4 girls working late. A shop that should have been empty except for them. A locked door. A fire that came afterward. Each element is clear on its own. Together, they form something that refuses coherence. The absence of noise remains one of the most persistent questions, even if it is never spoken aloud. Not because sound must accompany violence, but because silence requires explanation. Silence suggests either control or inevitability. Neither option is comforting. Control implies that fear was managed. Inevitability implies that resistance felt useless. Neither interpretation can be proven. Both linger. The investigators who first responded to the scene carried its weight long after their shifts ended. Some spoke of it as something that followed them home, not vividly, but persistently. A heaviness rather than an image. The knowledge that something had occurred which could not be undone, understood, or properly contained. Scenes like that resist closure. They do not resolve internally. They remain open, even when the physical space is sealed and cleared. The fire altered more than evidence. It altered perception. It ensured that the crime would never be remembered as it happened, only as it was discovered. That distinction matters. Discovery is incomplete by nature. It begins after the fact. It arrives too late. What was discovered that night was not the crime itself, but its remains. The remains suggested order rather than chaos, deliberate actions rather than panic, choices rather than accidents. These implications are subtle, but they persist because nothing contradicts them. The restraint used, the grouping of the bodies, the decision to ignite the fire after everything else was over. Each detail points to a sequence governed by intention. Intention without explanation is unsettling in a particular way. It removes the comfort of randomness. It suggests deliberation without offering insight into purpose. The families learned early that answers might never arrive, not because no one was trying, but because the structure of the case did not allow for them. The fire, the absence of witnesses, the lack of physical evidence all converged to create a barrier that effort alone could not overcome. That realization did not come suddenly. It settled in slowly, over years of waiting for something that never happened. Waiting becomes its own form of endurance. Public interest ebbed and flowed, but the families remained. Their lives continued alongside the case, shaped by it but not defined entirely by it. Grief does not stop time. It moves with it, adapting, adjusting, finding ways to exist without resolution. The city did the same. Austin changed. It grew. It expanded. Neighborhoods transformed. New streets were built. New routines formed. The place where the yogurt shop once stood blended into the larger fabric of the city, indistinguishable from countless other locations with no visible history. But history does not require markers to persist. It lives in memory, in silence, in the knowledge that something remains unfinished. The case does not resurface often, but when it does, it brings the same quiet disturbance it always has. Not shock, not outrage, a subdued recognition that some stories never reach their final sentence. The fire was brief. The consequences were permanent. The story remains open, not because it is unfolding, but because it never closed. What remains after so much time is not a search for answers, but an awareness of their absence. The case no longer feels like something that will be solved one day. It feels like something that exists parallel to resolution, untouched by it. That shift is subtle, but once it happens, it does not reverse. The facts stay still. 4 girls were alive when the shop closed. 4 girls were dead when the fire was discovered. Everything between those points remains obscured. That gap is where meaning should live. Instead, it holds silence. The silence is not empty. It carries implications. It suggests restraint, timing, awareness of surroundings. It suggests that whoever was responsible understood the space they were in and the risks involved. That understanding did not come from nowhere. It came from observation, familiarity, or experience. But familiarity with what remains unclear. The shop was part of a strip center. Other businesses nearby. Other people not far away. The idea that such proximity did not translate into interruption remains difficult to absorb. It implies a narrowing of the world inside those walls, a separation between inside and outside that held firm long enough for everything to happen. That separation is unsettling because it is fragile. It could have broken at any moment. A knock, a sound, a passerby looking in. None of those things happened. Or if they did, they left no trace. Investigators have long considered whether the crime relied on intimidation rather than violence in its early moments. The possibility that control was established before fear fully registered. That deception played a role. That authority was implied or performed. These ideas persist because they account for the absence of disruption. They cannot be confirmed. The fire ensured that whatever sequence unfolded would never be fully reconstructed. It removed the ability to read the space the way investigators usually do. It flattened nuance. It erased small indicators that often matter most. Without those indicators, the case remains locked. The girls' personal histories do not provide direction. No threats, no stalking, no known conflicts. Their lives do not point outward toward a specific danger. They remain what they were that night, young people at work expecting to go home. That expectation was shared by parents, by siblings, by friends, by the girls themselves. Expectations are powerful because they shape behavior. They create trust. They allow routine to continue uninterrupted. That trust was broken completely. The aftermath reshaped how safety was perceived, even if that change was never articulated. Late-night shifts felt different afterward. Small shops felt more exposed. The idea that visibility equaled safety no longer held the same weight. These shifts happened quietly. No policies changed immediately. No public reckoning occurred. The impact was internal, dispersed across thousands of individual choices made without conscious reference to the case. The city adapted without acknowledging adaptation. The case itself remained static. It did not evolve alongside those changes. It stayed fixed in the moment it was discovered, defined by fire damage and unanswered questions. Nothing added later altered that definition. Occasionally, a new technology would spark brief reconsideration. A new forensic method. A new database. Each time, the same conclusion emerged. There was not enough left to work with. The fire had done its work too thoroughly. The evidence did not fail. It was removed. That distinction matters. It shifts responsibility from investigation to circumstance. It acknowledges that some losses cannot be recovered, no matter how advanced the tools become. The families came to understand this not through explanation, but through repetition. Each year without progress reinforced the same reality. Answers were not coming, not because no one cared, but because nothing remained to reveal them. This understanding did not bring peace. It brought endurance. Endurance does not resolve grief. It accommodates it. It allows life to continue without pretending that loss has been integrated or explained. It accepts uncertainty as permanent rather than temporary. The case exists in that same state. Permanent uncertainty. It does not fade. It does not conclude. It does not transform into clarity. The fire marked the end of the event, but not the end of its presence. That presence remains, quiet and unmoving, anchored to a night that never released what it took. Eventually, the case becomes defined less by what happened than by what did not. What did not surface? What did not align? What did not lead anywhere? These absences accumulate until they form a shape as real as any fact. The investigation never failed in a dramatic way. There was no single mistake that explains everything. Instead, there was a gradual narrowing of possibility until nothing remained but uncertainty. Each path ended quietly, not with contradiction, but with exhaustion. That quiet ending repeated itself again and again. The fire ensured that the crime would never be experienced as a sequence, only as an outcome. Investigators could study positions, materials, damage, but not moments, not reactions, not decisions unfolding in real time. The crime exists without motion, frozen after the fact. This lack of motion makes interpretation dangerous. When nothing moves, meaning can be imposed too easily. The case resists that imposition by offering just enough detail to prevent speculation from settling. It allows doubt to survive. The yogurt shop was a place of routine. Routine breeds familiarity. Familiarity breeds assumption. That chain holds until it breaks. When it broke here, it did so completely. There was no partial failure, no near miss. The system did not bend. It collapsed. That collapse left no blueprint for prevention because the cause was never identified. Without cause, there can be no correction. Only caution. The city absorbed that caution quietly. No announcements, no formal acknowledgement, just small changes in behavior distributed unevenly across time and people. Parents became more alert, workers more aware. The feeling passed down without being named. The case itself remained untouched by these adaptations. It stayed exactly where it began, anchored to a night defined by firelight and silence. Investigators who return to the files years later often remark on how familiar everything feels. Not because it is remembered clearly, but because it never changed. The same photographs, the same reports, the same unanswered questions. There is no sense of progress to orient oneself against. This stasis creates a strange intimacy with the case. It becomes known through repetition rather than discovery. Each review reinforces what is missing rather than revealing something new. The families understand this better than anyone. They have lived alongside the same absence for years. They have learned what not knowing feels like when it does not resolve. It becomes part of daily life, integrated quietly without explanation. They do not wait for answers anymore. Waiting implies expectation. Expectation implies disappointment. Instead, they carry the possibility without attaching themselves to it. That restraint mirrors the case itself. The absence of resolution does not mean the absence of impact. The crime altered lives permanently, even without explanation. It altered perceptions of safety, trust, and routine. It left marks that cannot be traced back to a single source, but exist nonetheless. The fire was meant to end something. Instead, it ensured continuation. Continuation without clarity, without conclusion. without narrative satisfaction. The story exists now as a closed system that cannot be opened further. Everything that can be known is known. Everything that remains unknown is inaccessible. The boundary between the two is fixed. Nothing crosses it. The case does not wait in anticipation. It waits in stillness. 4 girls went to work and did not return. A fire followed. Silence settled in. What remains is not a mystery moving toward solution, but a reality that has accepted its own incompleteness. The end has not yet arrived. Over time, the case stops behaving like an investigation and starts behaving like a boundary. A line that cannot be crossed, only approached. Everything that leads up to it is visible. Everything beyond it remains inaccessible. The boundary was drawn that night. The shop closed. The door was locked. The fire came later. Between those moments, something happened that never entered the public record in full. That absence hardened into permanence. What is striking is how little the case changed, even as decades passed. New crimes occurred. New methods were developed. New confessions surfaced in other cases long thought unsolvable. The yogurt shop murders remained unaffected by all of it. They did not benefit from progress. They did not deteriorate into irrelevance. They simply stayed the same. This constancy is unsettling. Most unresolved cases either fade or fracture. They accumulate myths, exaggerations, distortions. This one did not. Its facts remained narrow and disciplined. The story never grew. It only echoed. That echo carried restraint rather than noise. There was never a credible public confession. Never a witness who came forward with clarity. Never a piece of evidence that shifted the center of gravity. Each revisit ended the same way it began, with the same unresolved core. The fire remains the dividing line. Everything before it is speculation. Everything after it is aftermath. There is no bridge between the two. Investigators sometimes describe the case as sealed by circumstance rather than failure. A rare convergence of timing, control, and destruction that left nothing workable behind. That explanation does not comfort. It only contextualizes the absence. Context does not reduce loss. The families have lived with that boundary for years. They have learned where it stands and how not to push against it. Pushing implies movement. Movement implies possibility. Possibility can become painful when it does not materialize. Instead, they exist alongside the case, not inside it. It is part of their lives, but not the only thing that defines them. That balance did not come easily. It developed slowly, through necessity rather than choice. The girls remain present in memory, but not in sequence. They are remembered as they were before the night, not during it. The events inside the shop are not reconstructed in imagination. They are left untouched, unfilled. That restraint matters. It prevents speculation from becoming a second violation. It preserves dignity by refusing to invent what cannot be known. The city has adopted a similar restraint. There is no fixation, no ritualized remembrance imposed on the space. The history exists quietly, without markers. It is carried by those who remember, rather than displayed for those who do not. This quietness does not imply forgetting. It implies containment. The case exists in containment now, preserved unchanged, unresolved. It does not ask to be solved. It does not invite reinterpretation. It simply remains. The fire burned out long ago. The evidence cooled. The questions stayed. And they remain exactly where they were left, waiting without expectation, suspended in a silence that has never broken. This is still not the end. What lingers most strongly is not shock, but steadiness. The case has settled into a fixed shape, one that does not invite escalation or release. It holds its position, unchanged, immune to narrative pressure. The longer it exists this way, the more it reshapes how absence itself is understood. Absence is usually temporary, a gap to be filled, a pause before continuation. In this case, absence became structural. It supports the entire story. Without it, there would be resolution. With it, everything remains suspended. The crime did not leave behind a trail. It left behind a void. That void has edges. It is bordered by facts that cannot be expanded. The time window, the location, the aftermath. Investigators know exactly where the unknown begins. They also know it does not end. This awareness changes how the case is handled. There is no urgency left, only vigilance. No anticipation, only readiness. The file is not active, but it is not dormant either. It exists in a state of perpetual availability, waiting for something external to disturb it. Nothing has. The fire, in retrospect, feels less like an act of destruction and more like an act of control extended into the future. It dictated how the crime would be remembered. It ensured that the most critical moments would never be seen, never reconstructed, never placed into sequence. That control continues to function decades later. Investigators cannot re-enter the scene as it was. They cannot walk the space as it existed. They cannot observe what was visible through the windows that night. They cannot test sound, movement, reaction time. All of that vanished with the building. What remains is a flattened version of reality. Diagrams instead of space. Descriptions instead of experience. Interpretation instead of observation. This flattening limits certainty. The case has often been described as emotionally difficult rather than technically complex. There are no hidden ciphers to crack, no layered conspiracies to unravel, just a straightforward act of violence that left no usable imprint behind. That simplicity is deceptive. Simple crimes are usually easier to solve. This one was not. It existed at the intersection of simplicity and invisibility, where ordinary elements aligned in an extraordinary way. The girls were not isolated in the wilderness. They were not hidden from the world. They were in a public place, at work, at the end of a routine day. That context deepens the disturbance. The idea that something so final could happen without being seen or stopped undermines assumptions about proximity and safety. It suggests that visibility does not guarantee protection, that normalcy can mask vulnerability rather than prevent it. These implications persist quietly. The city does not articulate them, but they exist in behavior, in caution, in awareness that never fully recedes. The case altered perception without issuing instruction. It taught without explaining. The families exist with a different kind of knowledge. They know where the story ends, not in time, but in certainty. They know which questions will never be answered. That knowledge did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly through repetition of silence. Each year without change reinforced the same conclusion. The case does not move forward. It does not move backward. It holds. Holding is not passive. It requires maintenance. Records are preserved. Evidence is safeguarded. Names are remembered. The refusal to close the case is itself an action, even if it produces nothing visible. That refusal acknowledges something important. That absence of answers does not equal absence of responsibility. The responsibility now is to preserve the truth that exists, incomplete as it is, without pretending it is whole. The yogurt shop murders remain defined by what cannot be recovered. That loss is permanent. It does not diminish with time. It does not become manageable. It simply becomes familiar. Familiarity does not soften it. It only makes the silence easier to carry. The story continues in that silence, unchanged, unresolved, waiting in a stillness that has become its natural state. The case endures as a constant reminder that not all violence announces itself in a way that can later be traced. Some acts leave no echo loud enough to follow. They occur and then they recede, leaving behind a space that resists occupation. This resistance defines the yogurt shop murders more than any physical detail ever could. There was no chase. No public confrontation, no moment of interruption. What happened unfolded entirely within its own boundaries, insulated from the outside world by timing, silence, and control. That insulation held. The absence of interruption is not simply a detail. It is the condition that allowed everything else to follow. Without it, the sequence would have broken. Someone would have noticed. Someone would have heard. Someone would have arrived too early. No one did. That absence continues to feel improbable, even decades later. Not impossible, but improbable enough to unsettle anyone who considers it too closely. It suggests a narrow window in which every variable aligned perfectly. Windows like that are rare. They are also unpredictable. This unpredictability prevents the case from becoming a warning in the traditional sense. There is nothing clear to avoid, no specific behavior to change, no identifiable threat to recognize. The danger was not visible until it was already complete. The case offers no guidance, only awareness. Investigators often reflect on how little the passage of time has clarified. In some cases, years bring perspective. Distance sharpens focus. Here, distance only confirms that the original limitations remain intact. Nothing new has emerged to reframe the evidence. The fire remains the final decisive act. It did not end the crime, but it defined how the crime would live on. It ensured that the most critical moments would never be accessed. It turned sequence into aftermath. That transformation was irreversible. The evidence that survived is static. It does not degrade further, but it does not evolve either. It remains locked in the state it was found, incapable of producing new meaning. Each review ends where it began. The families understand this stagnation intimately. They have experienced it not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality. Each year without progress reinforces the same truth. The answers they hoped for are not forthcoming. Hope over time shifts its form. It becomes quieter, less insistent, more cautious. It exists without expectation. The city mirrors this shift. There is no active demand for resolution, no pressure campaigns, no recurring headlines. The case exists without momentum, sustained only by memory and record. This does not diminish its significance. It alters its role. The yogurt shop murders are no longer a question waiting to be answered. They are a fact waiting to be acknowledged repeatedly. A reminder that certainty has limits. That effort does not always produce clarity. The girls remain present not through narrative, but through absence. Their lives are remembered for what they were, not reconstructed for what they might have endured. That restraint preserves something essential. Speculation would fill the silence easily. It is not allowed to. The silence remains intact. The case has reached a state where nothing can be added without evidence, and no evidence has appeared. This equilibrium holds. It does not resolve. It does not collapse. It simply persists. The fire marked the end of the night. The case marked the beginning of a stillness that never lifted. Everything that could be said has been said. Everything that could be found has been found. What remains is what was never left behind. The story continues to exist, unchanged, incomplete, and unyielding, held in a silence that time has learned not to disturb. At some point, the case stops being measured in years and starts being measured in repetitions. The same files opened again. The same evidence reviewed again. The same conclusions reached again. This repetition does not dull the impact. It reinforces it. Nothing changes. The conditions that define the crime remain fixed. The night, the location, the aftermaths. They do not gain clarity through familiarity. They only confirm how little was ever truly known. The idea of chance becomes unavoidable, not as an explanation, but as a component. Chance that the shop was empty. Chance that no one passed close enough to notice. Chance that the fire took hold as intended. Each element alone might be ordinary. Together they produced something irreversible. Chance does not feel satisfying as a factor. It removes agency from understanding. It suggests that events align without reason. That discomfort lingers because it cannot be resolved. Yet chance does not act alone. There was intention. There was control. There was follow-through. The coexistence of chance and intention complicates everything. It suggests that preparation met opportunity at exactly the right moment. That alignment is rare, but not impossible. The case exists as proof of that. Investigators have often returned to the idea of timing, not just when the crime occurred, but how it fit into the surrounding routines. Closing time, reduced traffic, limited visibility. These elements are mundane, but together they form a pattern of vulnerability. Patterns usually point somewhere. This one does not. It only explains how the crime could happen, not who made it happen. The fire ensured that any subtle missteps would be erased. Footprints blurred, surfaces altered, sequences destroyed. What survived did so unevenly, leaving investigators with fragments that refused to assemble into a coherent whole. That incoherence becomes permanent. The case does not allow for a dominant theory. Every explanation remains provisional, conditional, incomplete. This prevents the formation of a narrative that could satisfy public understanding. It also prevents closure. Closure requires alignment. Alignment never occurred. The families have learned to exist without that alignment. They do not wait for the case to resolve before moving forward. They move forward alongside it, carrying its weight without letting it define every moment. This coexistence is not acceptance. It is endurance. The city does the same. It does not confront the case daily. It does not avoid it either. It acknowledges its existence without demanding resolution. This balance is not deliberate. It evolved naturally as time passed and nothing changed. The site where the shop once stood remains unmarked, not because the event is forgotten, but because marking it would suggest something settled there. Nothing has. The absence of a marker mirrors the absence of answers. Both are intentional in their own way. Both refuse to create a sense of completion where none exists. The case continues to occupy a specific space in collective memory. Not prominent, not obscure, present enough to be remembered, distant enough to be lived with. This is the space unresolved cases eventually inhabit. They are not active. They are not dormant. They are suspended. Suspension is not neutral. It holds tension indefinitely. It does not release it. It does not transform it. It simply maintains it. The yogurt shop murders remain suspended in this way, untouched by progress, unaltered by reinterpretation, defined not by discovery but by absence. The fire did not end the story. It fixed it in place, and it remains there, unmoving, waiting in a silence that has become permanent. Eventually, the case becomes less about investigation and more about recognition. Recognition that something occurred which will never fully enter the realm of explanation. That recognition does not arrive suddenly. It develops slowly, through repetition of the same unanswered questions, through years in which nothing new alters the landscape. The absence becomes normalized, not accepted but understood as permanent. Those who return to the case after long periods away often describe a strange familiarity, not with details but with the feeling it produces, a sense of imbalance, of something incomplete that cannot be corrected. That feeling arrives before any facts are reviewed. It is embedded in the case itself. The facts follow afterward. 4 girls, 1 shop, 1 night, a fire set deliberately after everything else was over. Nothing about that sequence suggests confusion. It suggests order. And yet that order never translated into understanding. The contradiction remains. Crimes that involve chaos often leave traces. Mistakes, interruptions. This one did not. It unfolded cleanly enough to erase itself. That cleanliness is unsettling because it implies deliberation without offering insight into intent. Deliberation without motive is difficult to process. Investigators have long acknowledged that the case challenges assumptions about how crimes are supposed to behave. There was no escalation visible to outsiders, no visible breakdown, no audible disturbance. The violence remained contained until it was already irreversible. Containment becomes the defining feature. The shop functioned as a closed system that night. What happened inside did not leak outward until smoke forced it to. By then, the crime was complete. The fire announced aftermath, not danger. That timing mattered. It ensured that response arrived too late to alter outcome. It transformed the role of witnesses from participants to discoverers. What they encountered was not an event in motion, but an end state. End states offer limited information. They show what happened, not how it unfolded. They reveal consequence, not process. In this case, the process is what vanished. The families have lived with that disappearance for decades. They know where the story stops providing answers. They have reached that boundary countless times. Each return confirms the same thing. There is nothing new beyond it. This knowledge does not erase grief. It changes how grief is carried. It becomes quieter, less outward-facing, more internal. It integrates into daily life without resolving. The city reflects that integration. The case is not revisited often, but it is not forgotten either. It exists as part of a shared understanding that some events do not resolve neatly, that some questions persist without answers. This understanding does not comfort. It stabilizes. Stability without resolution is its own kind of weight. The case remains open in the technical sense, but functionally it exists in stasis. It is preserved, not pursued. Maintained, not advanced. This is not neglect. It is realism. Realism acknowledges limits. The fire imposed those limits permanently. It removed the possibility of full reconstruction. It ensured that the most critical moments would remain inaccessible. No future technology can restore what was never preserved. That loss is final. The yogurt shop murders endure as an example of how violence can occur without yielding understanding, how control can be exercised without leaving a trace, how absence can become more powerful than evidence. The story does not progress toward an ending. It holds its position. What happened that night remains fixed in time, unreachable, unchanged. The silence that followed did not fade. It expanded, settling into the years that came after, shaping memory without revealing truth. The fire burned briefly. The aftermath did not. The story continues, unresolved, still not complete. There is a point where repetition itself becomes the story. The same unanswered elements recur so often that they no longer feel like questions. They feel like fixtures, part of the structure, something built into the case from the beginning. The locked door, the absence of witnesses, the fire set after everything else was finished. These details are not clues anymore. They are boundaries. Investigators learned early that pushing against those boundaries yielded nothing. The answers did not lie just beyond effort. They were simply not there. The case was defined by what had been removed before anyone arrived. The fire was not an act of panic. Panic leaves disorder. It leaves haste. It leaves mistakes. This fire did not. It was controlled enough to do what it was meant to do. It destroyed context without destroying everything. That balance suggests planning. Planning implies forethought. Forethought implies awareness of consequence. Someone understood what would matter later. The absence of forensic clarity is not accidental. It is the result of deliberate action layered on top of opportunity. That combination is rare. It does not require genius. It requires timing and restraint. Both were present. The city has carried this understanding quietly. Not articulated, not debated publicly, but absorbed. It exists beneath conversations about safety, about youth, about late-night work. It informs behavior without being referenced directly. This kind of influence is subtle. It does not announce itself. It persists. The families have lived with a different influence. Their lives are shaped by a before and after that never reconciled. The after did not provide explanation or meaning. It provided absence. Living with absence requires a different kind of strength. Not resolution, but accommodation. Accommodation does not mean peace. It means continuity. The case did not resolve, but life continued. That coexistence defines everything that followed. Investigators eventually reached a shared understanding, even if it was never formally stated. The case would not be solved by re-examining the same evidence. It would only move if something external intervened. A confession, a piece of information withheld for decades, a chance event. None occurred. The case settled into stillness. Stillness does not equal forgetting. It equals suspension. The file remains open because closing it would imply certainty. Certainty never arrived. Leaving it open acknowledges the truth of the situation. That truth is simple and unsettling. 4 girls were killed. The people responsible were never identified. The circumstances that allowed it remain only partially visible. Nothing more can be stated without speculation. Speculation would fill the silence easily. It is resisted. The city's relationship with the case is defined by that restraint. There is no appetite for sensationalism, no effort to force meaning where none exists. The story is allowed to remain incomplete. This incompleteness is not failure. It is accuracy. Accuracy acknowledges limits. It recognizes when evidence cannot support conclusion. It respects absence rather than attempting to erase it with narrative. The yogurt shop murders exist in this accurate state. Unresolved, unfinished, unexplained. The fire marked the end of the night, but it did not mark the end of the case. It marked the beginning of a silence that continues to define everything that followed. That silence has not broken. It has not thinned. It has not clarified. It remains exactly as it was when the flames died down and the shop stood burned and empty, holding secrets that never left with the smoke. The story continues to exist without movement, without answers, without an ending. The case reaches a stage where even language begins to fail it. Words like mystery, tragedy, and crime feel inadequate, not because the events were too complex, but because they were too final. Language is built to explain, to connect cause and effect. This case offers no such structure. What remains is a record of damage. Damage to bodies. Damage to a place. Damage to certainty. The fire stands as the last visible action. Flames are easier to understand than silence. Fire announces itself. It leaves marks. It produces an end state that can be documented. In contrast, everything before it remains inaccessible, preserved only in absence. That imbalance defines the narrative. Investigators have often noted that the case feels unfinished not because something is missing from the record, but because something was deliberately removed before the record could begin. The crime did not unfold into documentation. Documentation arrived too late. This timing cannot be corrected. The idea that someone could act with such restraint, such patience, and then disappear completely unsettles because it contradicts expectations about human error. Most crimes reveal their perpetrators through mistakes. This one did not. Or if it did, those mistakes were consumed by fire. The result is a case that feels sealed rather than unsolved. Sealed implies closure without understanding. Unsolved implies potential. This case exists somewhere between the two. The girls' lives, meanwhile, are remembered without reference to their deaths whenever possible. Families and friends preserve what came before, not what ended everything. The final night is not reconstructed in detail. It is left untouched, unspoken, as if revisiting it too closely would constitute another loss. That choice is intentional. Speculation would not restore anything. It would only intrude on what remains private. Silence becomes a form of respect rather than avoidance. The city reflects this posture. There is no mythologizing, no exaggeration. The facts remain narrow, disciplined, and heavy. The story is not embellished because embellishment would imply understanding. There is none. Time continues to pass, indifferent to unresolved questions. New lives begin. Others end. The case remains exactly where it was left, immune to both decay and progress. It exists as a fixed point. When people encounter the story unexpectedly, the reaction is not shock but disquiet. Not outrage but unease. The sense that something essential is missing and always will be. That feeling lingers longer than details ever could. The yogurt shop murders do not provoke fear in the conventional sense. They provoke uncertainty. The understanding that control can exist without explanation. That violence can occur without warning. That aftermath does not guarantee insight. These realizations settle quietly. The fire was brief. The smoke cleared. The building was removed. Nothing else followed. No arrests that held. No confessions that endured. No evidence that spoke clearly enough. The case did not move toward resolution. It moved into stillness. That stillness is not passive. It holds memory in place. It prevents forgetting. It ensures that the absence remains acknowledged, even if it cannot be filled. The story exists now as a boundary rather than a path. It can be approached, examined, respected, but not crossed. Everything beyond it remains unreachable. The night ended. The silence did not. The story continues, unchanged, unresolved, and incomplete, waiting in a space where endings do not arrive. The case does not drift. It stays anchored, held in place by the same unmovable facts. Over time, even the urge to reinterpret those facts weakens, not because they have been understood, but because they have resisted understanding for so long that reinterpretation begins to feel intrusive. The night is fixed. Investigators know the order of discovery better than the order of events. They know how the scene looked when it was entered. They know what was damaged, what survived, what could be cataloged. They know the limits of what fire allowed them to see. They do not know the sequence that mattered most. The fire transformed the scene into a conclusion without a beginning. That inversion shaped everything that followed. Instead of tracing escalation, investigators were left tracing residue. Instead of understanding intent, they measured aftermath. This is not how most crimes are solved. The lack of trajectory keeps the case suspended. There is no rising action, no turning point, no collapse into resolution. There is only an abrupt stop, followed by a long echo of stillness. The echo is what people remember, not the flames themselves, but what came after. The unanswered questions, the restrained language, the quiet acceptance that some things would never be recovered. Silence became the dominant feature of the case, not because people stopped talking, but because nothing new could be said honestly. Facts were finite. Speculation was resisted. What remained was repetition without progress. That repetition shaped memory. The yogurt shop murders are remembered not through detail, but through atmosphere. A sense of wrongness, of something that never fit into its surroundings, of violence that did not announce itself until it was already finished. This is why the case unsettles even those who know little about it. It violates expectations about how danger presents itself. There was no warning phase, no visible disruption. The transition from ordinary to catastrophic happened entirely out of sight. That invisibility is what persists. The girl's final moments remain sealed behind that invisibility. No reconstruction can reach them. No narrative can approximate them without crossing into speculation. They are left alone, preserved in absence. This restraint matters. It ensures that the story does not become exploitative. It remains factual without pretending to be complete. It acknowledges what is known and what is not, without blurring the line between the two. The families have lived with this distinction longer than anyone else. They know where facts end and silence begins. They do not push past that boundary. They carry it with them, integrating it into lives that had to continue without answers. The city does something similar. It holds the memory without revisiting it constantly. It does not ritualize the crime. It allows it to remain part of the past without forcing it into the present. This balance is fragile, but it has held. Occasionally, the case surfaces again. A mention, a reminder, a quiet acknowledgement that it still exists. Each time, the same realization follows. Nothing has changed. Nothing has moved. The fire accomplished more than destruction. It fixed the story in place. It ensured that the crime would never evolve into explanation. It created a permanent gap that no investigation could bridge. That gap defines everything. The yogurt shop murders are not an open question awaiting discovery. They are an unresolved reality that has accepted its own limits. The truth exists, but it does not circulate. It remains contained, isolated from proof. Until something disrupts that containment, the case remains exactly as it has always been. 4 girls went to work. A fire followed. Silence took hold. Nothing since has altered that sequence. The story continues unchanged, still without an ending. The case endures in a way that is difficult to articulate because endurance implies movement. This one does not move. It holds its shape fixed and unyielding, as if time passes around it rather than through it. Each year adds distance, but not depth. Nothing new fills the space where understanding should have grown. What investigators return to, again and again, is not evidence but circumstance. The shop's location, the late hours, the absence of customers, the quiet that settled over the strip center once the surrounding businesses closed. These circumstances are ordinary. They repeat every night in countless places. That repetition makes them invisible. It is only in retrospect that they acquire meaning. Only after something irreversible has happened. That invisibility is what allowed the crime to exist undetected. The locked door remains a quiet detail, but it carries weight. It suggests that what happened occurred after normal closing procedures, that no interruption was expected, that whatever entered the shop did so without resistance at the threshold. The boundary between inside and outside held until it no longer mattered. No forced entry was documented. No alarm was triggered. No immediate concern was raised. These absences do not point in one direction. They simply narrow the field of what is possible without revealing what is true. The fire altered the physical record, but it also altered the psychological one. It created a sense of finality that was deceptive. Fires feel conclusive. They leave ruins. They signal an end. But here, the fire was not an ending. It was a transition from event to silence. The silence that followed did not behave like an aftermath. It behaved like a continuation. Investigators found themselves working backward from damage rather than forward from action. This inversion shaped every decision that followed. Instead of asking what happened next, they asked what must have happened before. Each answer depended on assumptions that could not be verified. Assumptions weaken over time. As witnesses aged and memories softened, the case lost even the faint outlines it once had. Not because people forgot, but because recollection without reinforcement becomes unstable. Details blur. Certainty dissolves. What remains is impression rather than fact. The case cannot rely on impression. This is why it has not transformed into legend or myth. It resists dramatization. There is nothing to embellish without crossing into fiction. The story remains disciplined, restrained, factual, and incomplete. That incompleteness is what defines it. The girls' lives are remembered through fragments of normalcy. School schedules, work shifts, friendships, family routines. These fragments do not point toward danger. They point toward expectation. The expectation that the night would end the way nights usually do. Expectation is rarely documented. It is only noticed when it is violated. The violation here was total. The city absorbed that violation quietly. There were no sweeping changes that followed. No visible reordering of public life. Instead, there was a subtle recalibration of awareness. A recognition, rarely spoken, that ordinary spaces could become closed worlds under the right conditions. That recognition did not fade. It settled. The case itself remained unchanged as everything else adjusted around it. It did not adapt. It did not respond. It remained fixed, like a scar that does not heal but also does not reopen. People who revisit the case often expect a moment where it should turn, a point where new information might emerge. That moment never arrives. The narrative does not bend. It does not yield. The fire ensured that. By destroying context, it prevented sequence. By preventing sequence, it prevented explanation. Without explanation, the case could not progress toward resolution. This was not a failure of investigation. It was a limitation imposed at the moment the crime ended. The families have lived with that limitation longer than anyone else. They understand it not as theory, but as reality. They know where the story stops offering answers. They have learned not to push beyond that point. The city, too, has learned this boundary. It does not probe the case aggressively. It acknowledges it exists. It carries it forward without trying to transform it into something it is not. The yogurt shop murders exist now as a permanent interruption in narrative time. They do not resolve. They do not recede. They remain exactly where they were left. The night ended. The fire burned out. The silence remained. And it continues holding the story in place, unchanged, waiting without movement, without conclusion. The case settles into a rhythm that never changes. Not active, not dormant, simply present. It exists the way certain absences exist in families and cities, never discussed directly, yet always accounted for. A space left open because closing it would require something that does not exist. Investigators who inherited the file years later learned quickly what it was and what it was not. It was not a puzzle waiting for a clever solution. It was not a matter of one missed detail. It was a record of an event that had been deliberately stripped of sequence before anyone arrived to observe it. They could catalog what remained. They could not restore what was removed. The fire ensured that the crime would be known only in fragments. Heat erased timing. Smoke erased movement. Water erased subtlety. What survived did so unevenly, leaving behind facts that refused to align into a narrative. The girls were found together. They had been restrained. They had been assaulted. They had been killed. Those facts stand. Everything else dissolves at the edges. The absence of interruption remains the most difficult element to absorb, not because interruption was impossible, but because it was absent entirely. No passerby, no customer, no neighboring employees, no moment where outside life crossed into what was happening inside. The shop became sealed off from the world without appearing closed. That condition existed only briefly. It did not last long, but it lasted long enough. The people responsible understood something about timing, about routine, about how long ordinary quiet lasts before it attracts attention. That understanding did not require intelligence in the abstract sense. It required observation, patience, familiarity with normal rhythms. Normal rhythms failed that night. The fire followed not as chaos, but as punctuation. A deliberate mark placed at the end of the sequence to prevent anything from being read backward. It did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be sufficient. It was. What survived the fire told investigators what happened, but not how. That distinction matters more with time, not less. Without how, there is no motive that can be tested, no behavior that can be traced, no decision that can be examined. The crime exists without psychology. Attempts to impose one have always failed. Profiles require patterns. Patterns require repetition. This crime stands alone, singular, isolated, resistant to comparison. The families learned early that explanation might never arrive, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a gradual realization shaped by waiting. Each year without movement reinforced the same understanding. The story was not progressing toward resolution. Waiting changed form. It became quieter, less forward-looking, more internal. Life continued alongside the absence, not because the absence diminished, but because it had to be carried somehow. The city adapted in its own way. The case became something people knew about without needing to revisit. A reference point rather than an open wound. It remained present, but not consuming. The place where the shop once stood does not explain itself. There is no marker to translate history into context. The space looks like any other. People pass without stopping. Life continues uninterrupted. The absence is complete. What happened inside that shop remains sealed in time, not by law, but by circumstance. There is no new angle left to examine. No overlooked witness waiting to speak. No fragment of evidence poised to suddenly matter. Everything that exists has already been accounted for. The story does not move forward because there is nowhere for it to go. It does not retreat because it was never resolved. It holds its position, suspended between event and explanation. 4 girls went to work expecting to go home. They did not. A fire followed. Silence settled in. Nothing since has been able to disturb that silence. What remains after everything else has settled is a kind of stillness that does not belong to peace. It belongs to incompletion. The case does not feel paused. It feels finished in action, but unfinished in meaning. That distinction matters. The record is full. The understanding is not. There are no new avenues left unexplored. Every door that could be opened has been opened. Every name that could be spoken has been spoken. Every test that could be run has been run. The absence that remains is not due to neglect. It is due to removal. The fire accomplished that removal efficiently. By the time anyone arrived, the crime was already past. The space no longer contained moments, only consequences. That difference shaped everything that followed. Investigators were never chasing an unfolding event. They were interpreting residue. Residue does not explain intent. It does not reveal decision-making. It does not expose hesitation. It only confirms that something happened. The girls' final hours remain defined by what cannot be accessed. No reliable sequence. No confirmed interaction. No moment where control shifted or resistance changed course. Those moments existed, but they were not preserved. They were consumed. That consumption is permanent. The idea that someone could enter such an ordinary place and leave without being identified continues to disturb because it undermines assumptions about exposure. The shop was visible. The windows were clear. The street was real. And yet nothing crossed that boundary in time to matter. The separation between inside and outside held. That separation was temporary, fragile, and sufficient. The people responsible did not need the world to disappear. They only needed it to look away briefly. It did. The families exist with a knowledge that has no language. They know what cannot be recovered. They know which questions will never receive answers. That knowledge does not produce acceptance. It produces accommodation. Accommodation allows life to continue without pretending the absence is resolved. The city carries the case differently. It remembers without ritual. It acknowledges without emphasis. The story is not retold often, but it is not lost. It exists in the background, like a shadow that only appears at certain angles. The case no longer generates urgency. Urgency requires the possibility of change. What remains here is permanence. Permanence without explanation is unsettling in a way that does not fade. There is no final image to hold onto. No last exchange of words. No defining moment where everything becomes clear. The story ends where it begins, with a closed space, an ordinary night, and a sequence that never entered the record. The fire burned briefly. The damage endured. What happened inside that shop remains intact only in the form of absence. It has never been replaced by understanding. It has never been reshaped into narrative. It simply remains. 4 girls were lost. The people responsible were never named. The silence that followed was never broken. The case exists now exactly as it has for years, unresolved, unmoving, and resistant to conclusion. Nothing follows that silence. No discovery breaks it. No voice emerges from it. The case does not conclude because there is nothing left that can conclude it. What happened inside the yogurt shop exists only as an event that reached completion without leaving a path back to its beginning. The violence ended. The fire burned out. The building was removed. The city continued. The record stopped. Everything after that has been maintenance. Maintenance of files. Maintenance of memory. Maintenance of the truth that something remains unknown. The absence never turned into clarity. It did not soften into understanding. It simply stayed where it was placed, untouched by time. The girls' lives ended in a space that should have been safe, at an hour that should have been uneventful, during a routine that should have concluded without incident. That expectation never returned. It was replaced by awareness, quiet and permanent. There is no final revelation waiting beyond the horizon of years. No inevitable confession. No certainty delayed by time. What exists now is what will exist tomorrow. The fire did not hide the truth. It separated it from proof. That separation has never been crossed. The case remains where it has always been, complete in action, incomplete in meaning. A story that does not move forward or backward, only exists, suspended in a stillness that has learned to endure. And that is where it stays.